Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For me, it's evening. Thank you for joining us wherever you're joining us from. We are broadcasting this special edition of Let's Talk. This is Let's Talk BlackHat. We're broadcasting to Trend Micro's LinkedIn, to our Twitter, and we're also live on YouTube and on my own Twitter as well, where I totally forgot to promote this. So if you're joining us from there, thank you for noticing the single tweet that I made about this, and apologies to my employer for not doing more. We're here to talk about our presence at BlackHat this year, BlackHat 2020. Obviously, due to the global pandemic, the situation has very much changed for pretty much every conference this year. I know that my calendar and my travel schedule has never looked quite the way it does, and I'm sure that's the same for many of you out there. Trend Micro, as you know, we are a pure play security vendor. All we do is security. All we've ever done is security. You may not be aware, though, of the breadth of the technologies that we offer and the breadth of the platforms that we cover. So, of course, we do endpoint security, server security. Of course, we do network security. We're also the leaders in the cloud security space, and we're investing a lot of research and development into the growing IoT and OT spaces. At BlackHat 2020, this year, we've got a lot going on. We have an XDR threat challenge where Rachel Toback will be one of our guest commentators for that. So very much looking forward to that. And if you want to take part in that challenge, do come along and sign up. If you're very lucky or very observant, you'll find a particularly embarrassing / amusing video that we made last week of me advertising that particular threat challenge. So all the details are there. We've got 2 brand new research talks this year, and that's just a part of the 5 different sessions that we have. So I need to look a little bit down here because I want to introduce these people in order. I'm going to be joined by 3 of my fellow trenders, and we're going to discuss a little bit the stuff that we're announcing at the show, the research that we're talking about, and some of the other figures, statistics, trends, excuse the pun, that happens a lot in this company, that we've seen throughout the first half of this year when it comes to attacker behavior, or maybe even buying behavior, or security trends within the enterprise. So I'm joined today by 3 great colleagues. The first one I'll introduce is Bob Mcardle. Hey, Bob, how you doing?
All good. Yep.
Bob is one of our directors of our forward-looking threat research group. And we're going to be talking about some of the research papers that we're talking about at BlackHat. I'm also joined by my colleague Myla.
Hi.
Hey Myla, how are you doing?
Hey Rick, good day.
Good to see you. Myla is a director of security research at Trend. She is responsible for a large team who are kind of basically collecting, gathering threat intelligence, dissecting whether that's file behavior, IP addresses, URLs, and building up vulnerabilities and all the other stuff that we cover, and building up that general threat intelligence that really powers all of the Trend Micro products at the back end. And my final guest for today is a man who goes by a single letter. So when you hear me calling this person just a single letter, I'm not being rude. That's his name, although that's not what he typed on the screen. His name is Q. Q, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Rick. Good to be here.
You know, whenever I call you Q, for me, it's like you work for MI5 or something like that.
That's my favorite one. I probably prefer that over the Star Trek option.
Oh God, yeah, I forgot about that.
I'll take James Bond over that. Yeah.
So Q is our chief product officer, and when I was writing all of this down so that I would remember exactly which title everyone had, one of the things that struck me is that you need to change your title a little bit. So you need to add 2 more words, like chief perception problem and product officer, something like that, because then you could be C3PO, and that's just the best job title anyone could ever have. And I'm sure Bob would agree with that, looking at his background.
Yeah, I will do this. I would love to be C3PO. Awesome.
If you haven't noticed, if you look above Bob's head there, I think I'm counting how many? 4, I guess 5, 6.
The correct number is far too many. That's the actual official term for the number of Star Wars helmets. Yeah.
I have exactly the same number of records. That's a real coincidence. I have far too many of those. It's exactly the same amount, which is incredible. Q is he leads our hybrid cloud team and our network defense teams. But as C3PO, he's basically responsible for making sure that as an organization, we are on track with roadmap, products, and whatever else it takes to be fit for the future. Is that a good description, Q?
Perfect. Yeah, a lot of customer interaction as well. So
okay. Yeah. So we are gathered here today to talk about our activities at BlackHat this year. So one of the things that I mentioned there in that intro, Bob, it's a great one for you because 2 of the talks that we have are addressing brand new research, which is going to be released at the event, as far as I understand it. So what is that research? What are we talking about?
We've 2 papers coming out, both, I believe, on the Wednesday 5th, I think, if I remember rightly. And they're both on OT topics or operational technology, if you like. So that people would generally think of as ICS, is another term people would associate with that. So the first of those is going to be looking at what are called protocol gateways. So essentially, it's if you have a factory network, you have a lot of OT systems going on, and you have a lot of IT systems going on. The ones that probably most of our guests are more familiar with. So these little devices sit there and translate from one to the other. So when you want to send a command to the factory or you get data back, and we basically looked at them because they sit in that fantastic niche between the two, and looked at all the different weaknesses and vulnerabilities that might introduce that you may not be aware of. So we're going to go into more detail on that, and I can talk a bit more about it later on this session. And the second one then is also, again, for the OT environment, but both of these have risks that should be factored in by others as well. And that is looking at some of the proprietary languages that go into coding up of especially factory automation. By that, you would normally think of robot arms, right? Everybody's seen a car factory or something at some point in their life with all the arms assembling things, right? So they have proprietary software that tells them how to work. And we found that the great thing about that software is it's designed to give you so much flexibility that you can do anything you want with these. But for the security controls, they built them just for the stuff you're supposed to do with them. And as anybody here who's in security knows, that's a bad cocktail when you put those two together. Sure. So we will be releasing on both of those. So heavily focused on the side.
The kinds of technologies, whether software or hardware that you're referencing and researching there, how prevalent is that attached to an enterprise network? Because a lot of the time I think there's a perception, and I'm letting you go with this. I'm trying not to smile when I say it. A lot of the time there's a perception that never the twain shall meet when it comes to OT and IT or enterprise technology. Those are 2 completely separate, air-gapped, I said it, networks, and therefore we've never really had to worry too much about that stuff. How accurate is that?
That is accurate that's a perception. And it's inaccurate that's necessarily the reality, right? So of course, if you're in the OT space already, if you're a factory or something, those two are, you have your enterprise network and you have your OT network, and there will have to be a join in the middle because we're humans and nobody wants to jump over onto the air gap network, right? There's a reason people in militaries don't like working in skiffs, because it's painful to get all their data in and out, right? So same thing in those networks, but even in more traditional enterprises, as they grow, they start realizing that there may be that OT components to just their business, right? But they have to integrate with, and they want to do it in a way where me at my console here at home, working from home, and COVID times, can access that device on the other side of wherever it is, right?
I guess that's really exacerbated the problem, isn't it? The remote working stuff. Q, how you must speak to a lot of, I know you speak to a lot of different organizations in a lot of different industry verticals. Has the realization of OT related issues and attack vectors, is that a new thing, or is it only now being addressed and people were already aware of it?
I I believe from a customer behavior perspective, it's not a new thing, but this is the first time they're starting to address it from an IT perspective. So just in the last year, we've had a lot of customers say, I'm moving my OT into my IT department. And that's like moving oil into vinegar. Is that right? Oil and vinegar? Those are the two things that don't go. Yeah, right.
There's lots of things. That's definitely a pair of them, though, for sure.
So everybody said, hey, I used to be air gapped. I can't afford to do that. A lot of my sensor systems need to use cloud analytics and machine learning technologies. I've got to bring them online. So I'm moving OT into IT. And so I think they've been known about the attacks, but now they're actually having to deal and plan about them in their organization.
And what's happening? What's the outcome? What's the, how are people noticing that they're having a bad time when it comes to OT technology?
Usually they don't notice from an attack perspective just yet, because they jump in and then start moving really slowly, because they realize that the people in the OT think of gauges and the people in the IT think of Ethernet. And people in OT don't even have a server rack. So they're going to try to bring in equipment and there's no place to put it. They put it under a desk. It's covered in sawdust, right? So they kind of jump in, let's solve this problem, and then they back up and stop. And so I think they're just now starting to figure out, how do I start piecing all this together? So I don't think customers have really gotten to the point of where they've got an orchestrated incident response and attack system built around an OT environment. In many cases, some of maybe the auto manufacturers have probably moved the fastest on that. So we have a few customers that have successfully merged security operations and OT operations, but it's still quite rare to have a fully functional response system.
So those are kind of two very separate teams at the moment in terms of management, incident response, even threat hunting, I guess, is non-existent in most OT teams. Those kind of things.
It's very similar to American English and English, two nations separated by a common language.
Yeah.
The only bond between OT and IT is actual cable. That's it at the moment.
It's the T, the fact that they're both technology, and that's about it, right?
That's about it. Yeah.
And so, Mila, I know that your teams are responsible for kind of looking, as I said at the beginning, at the kind of here and now of what's happening. There have definitely been stories of and we're going to go into a lot more detail about the here and now in a second. I just want to focus on what we're talking about right now for a moment. I know that there have been a lot of stories in the news about attacks which have affected OT. Maybe you could talk about one or two of those. And what I'm really interested in is it your opinion that the OT is targeted, or that the OT is collateral damage due to the architecture?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we combine what Bob and Steve, I still want to call him Steve. I will never call him Quan. Okay, so Steve's talking about, when it talks about OT, there are two demonstrations that we see, at least in the first half, that really impacts what they're saying in terms of whether they're being targeted. Number one is that the fact that we've seen a lot of discovery, the vulnerability perspective, really targeting that space. I think we've seen about 7 out of 10 of the high risk, more severe cases is really functioning in the IT OT area. So that itself is a demonstration that there is a lot of noise and there's a lot of trembling around that. The challenge is, as we always say, the OT space really is not yet heavily connected, that security is a dynamic that they have to be presented with, right? Mm-hmm. The second point is that, yes, it is more of a collateral damage rather than a targeted one. Ideally, when you think like a hacker, which I always say, when you think about criminal, you would function very well, very successfully in the IT area, right? Not on the OT area. Yeah. However, when you create that damage, it is more felt on the OT area just because of the lack. I would not say lack, probably they're not more resonating or appreciating the level of security on that area, right? So it's more collateral damage. So I think that's where a lot of the conversation for the second half of the year will come in, on how these two dynamics will work. I am an optimist, but I don't think that will be an easy way to get in right now. I think it is there's still a lot of, I would say, dysfunctional pressure among these two major organizations to really meet halfway. But I think, there's a little bit of challenge in that area.
Yeah. When I was doing the previous season of Let's Talk Security, where this kind of conversation sort of started. I had Joe Slowick on as a guest, who is an expert in this area when it comes to threats and threat actors, and we had a really good hour-long conversation about this. And one of the things that I put to him is that if you enumerate the threats that have been specifically designed to target an OT environment, I don't remember, it's like five or six of them, because you're talking about the Stuxnets of the worlds and the Black Energy 3. And every single one of those takes a lot of domain expertise and knowledge of the systems that you're directly targeting. Is it true to say that in general terms, in run-of-the-mill cybercrime, that level of expertise and knowledge doesn't exist yet?
I think it exists, and I think Bob will be more, I guess, in a position to do that. But let's take a look at threat actors' perspective, in the campaign perspective. In our experience in looking at targeted campaign, I think this is the only year that we've seen specialized campaign threat actors really mobilizing in the IT/OT perspective, right? They are looking into this environment a little bit more. In the world of campaign, takes a lot of years to take a look at it. Right after Stuxnet, there's not a lot of famous campaign except for this one that we've seen it. They are moving into that area. The other one that we have to note is this is a very niche market. It is not something like you can access the playground at any given time, at any given platform, right? So it is very niche, but I always say it's high risk, but it's high gain, right? So I think that's where they're coming from. They're very small in the network, but they're there.
So Bob, why, and I this is kind of a loaded question because I know what your research priorities are and what your research calendar looks like. So why are we focusing so much time and attention on OT as an area of research? What's driving that?
So there's a couple of reasons. One, the nature of the team that I'm working with we're called forward-looking threat research for a reason. So we look 1 to 2 years ahead, right? So we're looking at not exactly with what's happening right now, but the bleeding edge and where it's going to, right? Because also when we're dealing in a product company, if you come up with an idea of an attack, you need to give the product teams time to develop out the solution, right? So we now have solutions in the OT space because we've been looking at this for a while. And it's perfectly fine. Like the conversation you had with Joe, I watched that, and you're right. There's only a limited number of OT specific, malwares and things at this point in time. But the kind of common misperception people have with cybercrime is they think it ramps up slowly, that it just gradually, like we'd have 2 more OT and then we have 3 more OT attacks and 4. It doesn't work that way. So crime works in small trickles and then it explodes. So it's almost like you've seen it with ransomware as a good example, right? The post-intrusion ransomware stuff, 1 or 2 people tried it, it was successful. 1 or 2 others tried it, it was successful. Then everybody did it because somebody, he just made a 1 million ransom. I'm going to do that. And then it just overnight, it escalates, massively. So the same thing would happen in that IT/OT crossover space. And we're seeing those trickles at this stage already. So there was the ECANS ransomware earlier this year, where it was a ransomware that deliberately killed processes on OT networks, right? It had specific ones as well. And that's one of those trickles, right? But what will happen is you will see another ransomware, somebody completely different in the next month or 2. It'll be like, let's try the same thing. Oh, we got paid as well. And then it will explode. So that's the point.
It's an interesting segue into what I was going to ask you next, actually, and you're kind of leading yourself into the answer of the next question, which is very cool. Well done.
I know what I was talking about.
The threat space obviously changes over time and always has done. And there's whatever lens you choose to look at it through, there's always a fantastic story over that period of time as to how the threat landscape has changed. One of the technologies that we are talking about, and obviously doing the threat defense challenge, is XDR at BlackHat 2020. So we're running this XDR threat defense challenge where you can try and do the root cause analysis and the threat hunting, and there was a prize. You could win yourself. I said it on the video. I have no idea what it is. But there is a prize, and it's a good one. What has happened in the threat landscape over the last whatever time period you choose that has made XDR such a critical technology? Because not only is it a new space where obviously Trend Micro are kind of leading, but other companies are beginning to innovate in that space as well. But also analysts are recognizing that XDR is a space in its own right and needs its solution. So that really only happens when there's a driving need for it. What is the driving need?
So there's a couple of things. One is obviously there's a driving need in the customer side, right? Because it's addressing some major customer pain points. But I focus more on the threat side, so the criminal side. So where criminals are evolving is, if you go back a few years ago when Trends were announcing, or a couple of years, longer years ago now, where we were talking about the smart protection network that we built up, right? Which is still obviously our core technology that XDR is built on top of. But in that day, we have seen a lot more automation in terms of attacks, right? So, and by and large, the 90% of the attacks that you see across the internet are still heavily automated. They're bots connecting to botnets and so on. And all those connectivities is something that the smart protection network approaches extremely well. But then you build on top of that the 10% that you're probably more worried about, which is nowadays, we have to help humans who admin large, complex networks to find the human attacker that is in that network, right? So they're on there somewhere. And the difference is it's a human attacker, not code. They might be using malware and tools, but it's a human pivoting around, laterally moving, getting things, making decisions. And part of that is you have to have much better visibility of all those parts. You can't have your endpoint products over here and your cloud product there and your network product there. You have to have them all in one console. And then the second thing you do, that's just a basic. Then what happens is you do that, they get flooded with just noise and data. So you have to make smart decisions for them because they can't handle that amount of things. So you give them contextual alerts, basically. You don't go, we've seen something suspicious in this one endpoint over here. You say, it looks like this endpoint has maybe been compromised, and then there was lateral movement across the network to this thing, and then they went to the cloud instance. And if you do the following, you can deploy solutions to deal with that. And that gives them what they need to be able to defend against a human as opposed to code.
Root cause analysis and finding patient zero, finding out what the right mitigation is at the beginning of the chain rather than stopping the bleeding wherever it's occurring, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
If I may
So it raises an interesting point. If we're saying that threats, see, this is why people don't like having conversations with me, because we're going one way and then I think something and we go off another way. So I apologize for this, but anyway, that's where we're going. If you're saying that, and I agree for the record, that as a defender now you're primarily defending against human behavior, right? You're defending against someone who's driving something, not someone who set something free and stepped away to have a bite to eat. Why have we not seen a huge decrease in volume? How is it that, I guess, a similar number of attackers, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, how is it that a similar number of attackers are driving a similar volume or maybe even slightly greater, we'll talk to Myla about that in a second, of threats, but they're driving them directly and not relying on mass automation of independent code?
Well, there's two reasons, and it's basically quite simply you're dealing with two businesses, right? So the criminal business models have matured to the point where there's still all that mass market, if you like, the small and medium businesses of the criminal enterprises that are building botnets by the dozen, and they're automated, and they're the fire and forget type stuff. And if you don't have solutions for them, they will compromise the network and move around and take it over. But then you have the more elite enterprise strategic, if you like, people, and they're going after a different market. So they're not going after the $1,000 off you, $1,000 off me people. They're going after we'll put the 2 months of effort in and we walk out with $1 million, and then we move on to the next one. And then what happens is those teams get very good at what they do, so they scale and they go, well, we have a framework in place, almost like a template that we follow as part of the business. And if we hire in 3 more criminals, they can run the second team doing the exact same thing, but now we can handle more customers, where customers are the poor victims on the other side. So
to anyone who's running or working in a startup, that probably sounds like a very familiar kind of business model, right? So scaling your business out. So Myla, we talked about the fact that what your team is responsible for and what you do, but one of the other things that you do that I didn't mention is that you basically write, edit, publish, obviously working with a bunch of other people within Trend Micro, but all of the annual reports, semi-annual reports, all the stats, all you mine all that stuff and pull interesting stories out. So what are the interesting stories from the first half of this year? It's been a year like no other, I think, in no small way. Is that true of the threat landscape as well, or is it very much business as usual?
I think it's always reflective of the lifestyle, the culture, and where we are at today. So I think it's an understatement that the first half is extremely busy. Similarly for the criminals, right? And we all know that. And I think we're going to talk about COVID later, but in essence, we've seen dramatic increase on attacks for first half. But to note, 80% of most of those attacks are really COVID threat scams related. But if we put that aside, which we are already very much aware of where the COVID trajectory is, the two major areas that I'd like to highlight for first half that probably we have not seen for a long time is on the area of targeted attack, which alludes to what we're talking about today, right? One of the uniqueness that we've seen in targeted attack that we've discovered for this first half is that they are working a little bit more on extremely smaller group, targeting mostly on cyber espionage, targeting mostly on industries that probably we have not seen a lot of action, like gambling, and smaller in the case that this is a cyber espionage happening in the gambling industry and Southeast Asia. So you can see if you invert the triangle, it becomes really, really, really small, but very successful. Similarly, I talk a little bit about targeted attack on IT/OT environment that we've recently discovered, but have yet to publish, but definitely it's in the play, right? So this is something very different from the campaigns that we've seen in the past. The second portion I'd like to talk a little bit about, you talked about volume control earlier. We've seen volume nonstop. Let's look at it in the area of ransomware. What is different for first half of this year on ransomware is the numbers. I always say, don't be deceived with the numbers. It might be going down, but it doesn't mean life is easier. Ransomware is a very good example of where it is really going to go and probably conquer us, right? There are the typical worm. It will not go away. These are legacy area. But two areas we've seen in ransomware this year is more on opportunistic ransomware. We've got the crisis as a good example there, where you are bleeding already, but they would continue to exploit you. That's what we call opportunistic level of ransomware. And the second one, as I said, is again, looking into targeted and breach organization, which means they are using exfiltrated information, and yet they will continue to do ransomware, right? So that's a very different level of ransomware that we're talking about, and that I think will dominate first half, at least in what we see.
It's interesting because with ransomware, the payoff is obvious, right? It's a business model that it doesn't take any level of intelligence to understand at all. It's extortion. It's been around forever, and we all know how it works. This just happens to be digital extortion. That's all. With the targeted attacks, particularly into smaller businesses and smaller groups, where's the payoff? How is that monetized? Because obviously, the major driver for online crime is finance in almost every case. Apart from the state level espionage stuff. So where's the payoff for that stuff?
Well, the payoff, remember, when we talk about payoff, there's two perspectives, at least in my perspective. One is the direct monetary currency, right? Which is really very low level. Because if I think like a threat actor, I'm probably going to go ransomware where there's more massive payoff. Yeah. But in targeted attack and campaign, highly likely you will not see the immediate payoff yet. The data that they have exfiltrated, the data that they're trying to mine right now is something that probably they will use in the next big one, right? So that is the payoff. The data that they have today is highly, I guess it's their precious asset that they need to harvest, do the same level of intelligence and threat analysis that we do, and take a look at where are they going to use this in a more, I would say, more prolific form of attack that keeps them out of the radar. So that for me is the payoff on a very, I guess, high risk, high attack campaigns.
Mm-hmm. So I can see we've had a question come in online, and I would encourage any of you watching this. This is the great advantage of watching live, is that you get to just jump in, and if you want me to ask a question to any of these three people here, I'll do it for you. So we have a question that's come in, and it's one for probably all three of you in various different ways. And Q, I think it's relevant to you as well, because you've been at Trend since forever, and you've probably seen a few changes in what I'm about to ask about. So that perspective would probably be really useful as well. But the question is, effectively, can we elaborate on the threat research at Trend Micro? So great question for you, Bob, and you, Milo, to talk about briefly about what you do and how you do it and who you interact with and all that cool stuff. And Q, I'd love to hear from you, in your long tenure at Trend Micro, what changes have we seen in that, and where do we think it's going in the future as an organization in terms of research? So Bob, do you want to start?
Sure. So we have many different threat research teams in Trend Micro with different focuses. So just speaking briefly to the one we are in, or that I'm in, it's a scouting team. So as I said, looking for that next 1 to 2 years of where we think technology is going to evolve to, where we think cybercrime is evolving to, and even social uses of the internet, like how we interact with technology, how that's going to change, because crime always follows that. So we focus on those areas to be kind of giving some advice of what we see coming down the road. And we're also the team that do most collaboration on international law enforcement cases. So Trend have had numerous successes down the years of collaborating with law enforcement on arrests, takedowns, and other things along those lines. So that's what we would focus on.
And what's the difference, Milo, with your group? So that's the FTR, the forward-looking threat research perspective. What's the Trend Labs perspective on how do you do what you do, and what do you do?
Yeah, I think it's a pivoted in many different direction. My analogy here is that in the past, we're almost like policemen on the street, trying to look for crimes, trying to observe what's happening, where the people are going, right? Where it has transitioned right now on a research perspective is that they are no longer on the street, but they're actually just right in front of this mini frames, looking into more telemetry, looking at sensor, reading them, look at the behavior. So it's more like transitioning from police on the street to more investigative and more active defense research. I think with and thank God for automation and technology, this has helped us really accelerate our way of really looking at the data and being able to really correlate a lot of this. And I think that's where we pivoted over time.
And how, so Q, like I said at the beginning, how has that changed over time? I mean, I know that you remember things like NIMDA and Blaster and Code Red and Love Letter and all the other things that seem to come from the Jurassic age or something now when you think about what malware was. And you're still here, you're still deep in the game. So how has the way that we as a company go about that research and about actioning that research, how has that changed over time?
Yeah, it's great. In fact, there's a fun story about the dinosaur part. My son, who's 25 now, still remembers when I had a slammer problem, and he thought it was like a medical issue, right? So that was like 2003. For a month, we dealt with slammer, and my son was like, "Oh, my dad's sick. He's got slammer," right? So yeah, I've been around. Yeah. So I actually want to highlight something on the customer side that very related to what Milo mentioned. So there's this huge movement around detect and respond in addition to protection, right? So from a vendor perspective and our threat research side, we go, okay, great. We've got the MITRE framework. We've got these ways of collecting more telemetry and looking into these threats in a much deeper way, either because there's humans involved and it's less automated, so it's a little harder to detect, or there's just a better framework for dealing with. So MITRE's done a great job in building these frameworks. Our customers have adopted those. But the problem, as Milo kind of mentioned, is the data. So at Trend, we've got legions of people who know how to deal with telemetry data. We can build systems to manage it. I talk to customers who they were overwhelmed when they were just doing protection. Now they've added 10x the amount of data, and they don't know what that data means. And more importantly, they don't know how to store it, manage it, clean it, cleanse it, turn it into actionable intelligence. And so it's been wonderful that they've been able to kind of bring in this telemetry and kind of get more research-oriented, deeper looks into their activities and their networks, even things like anomaly detection, baselining. But it's also thrown them for a loop in the fact that this data problem is so massive for them. Right. So a big change that we've seen in customers is, not only how do I automate my workflow, that's a big topic because I hate to waste time on the 90% that I'm kind of blocking and I don't care about and it's noisy. But how do I really take this data and look through it and deal with it? And so that's kind of, we see our vendor reaction to that is really, that is an ML, AI analytics problem. And if we can help bring those technologies to bear. And so it's kind of this discourse in a new way where the research depth in telemetry is super valuable from a security, investigation perspective,
Sure.
but it's just exacerbated the people problem at our customer side. And so I think the next round is cleaning all that up for everybody and managing their data for them. And they don't need to know what a data lake is and all those things.
Right.
We're not there yet.
But something I was going to add is like that's becoming a new thing that people can lean on their security partner, whether that's a vendor or a reseller or however they want to manage that security relationship, but they can lean on their security partner for enterprise scale, enterprise expertise, because it does take a data lake, it does take AI, it does take ML, just to kind of squelch out that noise that you were talking about at the beginning and allow you to focus on the things that are really important. So XDR is the do-it-yourself model, MDR for managed detection and response for people who want to outsource that kind of stuff. And those are new areas, right, where the industry as a whole, and Trend Micro absolutely as part of that, are really focusing and beginning to innovate and work out. Not only do we have to work out how to action this intelligence to better serve our customers through our products, but we have to work out how to action this intelligence to make it meaningful, irrespective of product, to the people that will benefit from it, right? As pure play intelligence, not as something that feeds a product.
Right.
Very cool.
And probably the only other topic I would say is kind of the cloud threat. So, as customers move workloads in the cloud, a lot of customers are firing up containers now or serverless. There are some cloud-specific threats, and getting the expertise on their side as well as our side to understand how unique those attacks. A lot of it's reusing old tactics, but a lot of it's attacking new entry points and misconfigurations, and so probably customers are struggling a bit with that as well.
So let's go there then. What's the why is the threat in the new formats, if you like, of cloud deployment, like containerization, like serverless? Why is and even AWS or Azure, Google Cloud, all of those platforms that are really gaining a lot of traction now, and I think even more so because of COVID-19. Why are they presenting new threats to organizations?
Yeah, it's from a tactics perspective, it's still probably all the same tactics. One, you have new technologies, so new vulnerabilities, new ways of configuring things like Redis, things like serverless technologies, where the security professionals don't necessarily know how those technologies work and how to investigate attacks. But I think probably the biggest trend is around the topics of DevOps and automation. So you're now just seeing cloud native technologies spun up and destroyed at light speed. So networks are ephemeral. These applications are, we deal with server customers who destroy their network 2.5 times a day. So they have 10,000 servers in the cloud. They create and destroy 25,000 servers every day, right? The problem is security people don't understand that the old model of I hand you a document that's got a policy in it, and you configure what you need to in your application or they don't understand.
Tick all the boxes.
Yeah, DevOps is not doing that. Like DevOps engineers are like, I don't do documents. Bring me code, bring me scripts, bring me automation, fit into my tool chain. And so security is kind of getting left behind.
And bring me APIs as well, right? That's also kind of a new thing because of that food chain thing. Don't bring me a point product, bring me an API that I can engineer into what I'm doing.
That's exactly right. If the first words out of your mouth as a security professional in my office aren't automation related, I've already kicked you out, right?
Yeah.
So even if the security teams have spun up on the cloud threats and the new technologies and the misconfigurations in the cloud environment, they're having a very hard time getting DevOps to follow their guidance or to do what they want them to do in terms of security. So they have very little visibility as to what's really happening out there. So
it's funny how when you get a group of people together to have a conversation, and let's be honest with the viewers, all four of us know each other very well. We've all been at Trend for a long time, and we've met on many, many occasions. But I think, in all honesty, this is the first time that the four of us have sat on our own and had a conversation with just the four of us. It's funny how things, when you start to have a conversation like this, things just begin to surface. So we started off talking about OT and the research that we're doing in that area and the problems that we're facing, or that our customers or people in the industry are facing when it comes to securing OT, and what the organizational challenges are there. And then I just listened to you talk about the cloud challenges, the DevOps challenges, the process challenges. It's the same thing. It's the same problem with two different parts of the business, but actually probably there's a very interesting triangular dynamic in both of those situations, particularly if there's an organization that's using OT and using cloud and using the newer technologies in cloud and API, and wants to engineer in XDR and needs to have the security team integrated with the OT team and with the DevOps team. It's the same challenge, right? It's just different areas of the business.
Yeah, that's right. And the unique part of COVID is throw on top of that the fact that nobody goes to the office anymore and they're all working from home now, right? Yeah. So
COVID, Mila, you said something which I don't think I've heard anybody say up until now. And I think I heard you right, but I'm going to double check it. You said something like, when you were talking about the H1 figures, 80% of the threats that you saw in the first half were COVID related in terms of bait or methodology, something like that. Is that what you said?
It's both, yes. And I think it's intuitive, right? We always say that a lot of these threat actors are opportunistic. So it is very intuitive that they will go there, they will stay there until probably we are still in this pandemic. But we have to also note that it has transitioned into an area where, and Steve talked about it, now they're transitioning a little bit less on the scams, on the bait, on the charity and stuff. This will not go away. However, the challenge that we're facing right now is we're all in these small frames now. We're working, and we're probably going to be working in the same scenario for until next year. So that means that they're moving a little bit on attacks related to probably remote operations, remote workplace. All of this elasticity that we're experiencing right now is where they're pivoting very quickly. Are we going to see numbers as much as 80%? I don't think so, right? But that's where it's going to come in on many aspects. Number one is the tools that you and I are using, and we've seen this happening in a lot of teleconferencing style. The second one is that I cannot imagine how our own IT guys and InfoSec will troubleshoot a lot of these challenges with the other employees, right? Trying to, help and protect you. So which means remote access tools and equivalent will be a natural, probably good habitat for the attackers to probably join the bandwagon. And the third, where I'm very, very scared of in terms of the COVID attack, is really the data contamination. Because there's a blur line between helping you with your privacy, but also protecting the privacy and classified information that you and I are transacting today. So that's the next route of all this COVID, related scams and attacks will probably come into play.
Okay. I'm blown away by the scale of the migration towards using COVID as a lure. I mean, obviously, it's probably the first global phenomenon that's affected all of us, certainly in my lifetime, and probably even longer than that, because that time period does exist. So I get right. Say again, Bob?
So I think it's going to go in waves as well, right? So as Mila said, we're already starting to see that the lures go down, right, for the last month or so, and that's partially because basically the whole planet is bored of hearing about COVID, right? Or certain regions are, right? So it used to be where you check the news every single day, and now it's pretty much like the news headline is news just saying world is still on fire. And you're like, well, I know. Yeah. What's the second news story, right? So, but when second waves of the virus start coming later in the year, which, sorry, this is how viruses work, then that will kick in again as a lure all over again. So. Sure. Yeah, definitely will be. And then the work from home stuff that Mila mentioned is key for a couple of other reasons as well. So one of the things that, if you just think of like customer networks, they would have been before where any external connection into the network would be treated with some level of suspicion, even if it's you have some of your workforce. Now everybody's external, right? So they have, even though they have VPNs and things like that, they have to treat all of those as suspicious, which is a whole different world to play in and try and defend.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, on that note, it gives me a chance to drop into the question that has come in from Jonathan on YouTube, because we've been talking about XDR. If you see me looking down here, by the way, it's because I'm too vain to wear my glasses when I'm broadcasting. So yeah, questions came in, and it related to XDR, obviously a technology we've been referencing a lot in this conversation, and it's a question that I hear a lot. So it's a great one to pick up and address now. And I think, Steve, you should probably have first shot at this. The question is kind of, will XDR work with the SIM that I already have, or is XDR a SIM? But I think in a nutshell, the question is, what's the difference?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, this is a great question. And again, I get this question every day, similar to Rick. Yeah, so XDR and SIM are what I would say complementary. So, but there's really just two very simple reasons SIM is not XDR and XDR is not SIM. The first one is telemetry. So we talked about the data problem that everybody's having now that they've moved from protection, which was about maybe 10% of the data set that you collect when you do detect and respond. So now that we've also added detect and respond, people are collecting 10 times the amount of data. So in a SIM environment, we have customers who get 1 billion events in their SIM a month or more, right? To add 10 billion to that doesn't really help solve the SIM problem. So one of the things is the XDR vendors are storing the telemetry, usually in the cloud, and sifting through that, so you don't have to have the data costs and the management problems of us sending all that telemetry information. This is things like system processes. This is things like VPC flow logs in the cloud. Data sets that are not really events, so they're not getting sent to SIM. And if you sent them to SIM, your SIM would explode, and you would have even a harder time than you have today with data. So the first one is the data load is so big that the XDR vendors manage that either on-premise, but mostly in the cloud, prior to sending it to SIM. We all work with SIM. We're very partners with SIM. The second one is probably the biggest difference, and it's around detections. And this is where SIM and XDR work very well together. So in the past, prior to XDR, without the ability to do analytics and detections at the telemetry layer, security vendors would just send whatever event they had to SIM. I saw a malware, I blocked it, I'm sending that up. I see something suspicious, not sure, I'm gonna send that up. What we do now as XDR vendors is we actually correlate all that into detections instead of just events or alerts. So in the past, we may send 1,000 events to a SIM in a day. In the XDR world, we'll send one detection or one attack map that would say—
and that's a whole story, effectively.
That's right. And the reason we can do that, I want to say better than a SIM, because SIMs are great, but the reason we can do that in a more detail is because we own the telemetry and we have much broader context. Because if I'm sending events to SIM, I need to standardize those into a much smaller subset of all the data I'm collecting as an XDR vendor. So we really do work very well together with SIM. And the big impact now is we're going to send you a whole lot less events. They're now going to be detections, and they're going to be much more meaningful. So your SIM should get more effective, but we don't replace SIM as an XDR vendor. Hopefully that was a good, relatively simple description.
Made sense to me. So while I squint at the screen to attempt to address the next question, there was another couple of things that I had on my list of questions, which is just there. And one of them is Linux as a platform, because I know that it's an area that is, let's say, relatively neglected in security solution terms. And it's an area that for security administrators and teams can pose somewhat of a challenge. Either it can be forgotten about, either it can be fingers crossed and forgotten about, or you can try and do something about it. But there aren't that many solutions that directly address Linux as a platform. Is there a need, Myla and Bob, I suppose, is there a need to address Linux as a platform from a security perspective? I.e., is there a risk? Is there a threat?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I think the biggest mental model that we have to break is that although we know that they are the OS platforms and Windows are really outnumbered by tenfolds, Linux is still heavily targeted. Where Linux come into play really is on the server part, right?
Mhm.
We all know that the heart of our wonderful data center is really that server. And to them, it's priceless. So this is where Linux is becoming more and more vulnerable, is mostly on the Linux server point of view, right? So that's one area. The second one is that just like any malware and any attack, they're very customized. So we've seen growth, not in a lot of volume, but we've seen highly customized Linux attack, specifically in two areas. If you are going to code a particular malware, most of the time you will do the C and C++. It becomes more customized when an attacker is really investing in different coding mechanism. Like in the language of Linux, when you want to target them in an IoT botnet perspective, you're probably going to go language, which is very hard, right? So we are now seeing Linux also being used on IoT malware and technology. So
Right.
again, it might be not in volume, but they're there. And I think the third element is really on, we've talked about Linux also being used in a lot of crypto mining operations, just because it is easier
Mhm.
when you upload the kernel into the operations, it becomes really very hard to detect. So all of these three examples is giving you the level of, you have to give Linux the same love that you give across the other platforms that you are also using, because they're equally heavily compromised at the moment.
Yep. And then just to add to what Mila said, so absolutely, like Linux at the moment is generally if you're attacking Linux, you're attacking a server or IoT of various different types, everything from your home router to more industrial OT equipment like the stuff with the papers coming out on. And two key things is people often look at the numbers and say, well, show me all the latest Linux malware. And then sometimes they don't see that many, right? And you're like, well, there's nothing to worry about. And that's because if you're thinking like that, you have never been on a Linux machine in your life. Because if you have shell access to a Linux machine, you don't need malware. It is malware.
Yeah.
You have anything you could possibly dream of doing is there, and a small shell script or something, and you're golden. And the second thing is, because as we said, there's generally less security currently deployed on those machines than there would be on even cloud, or obviously cloud can run Linux, but then there is generally on Windows or other machines. Your dwell time as an attacker is a big advantage for you. So when you get on that machine, you're on it for a very long time before anybody notices, compared to other ones. And that's also sometimes where we see a little bit lack of innovation in the malware there, because you don't have to innovate. You have to innovate in the Windows world because you come up with something, our solutions, and everybody else stops it. Then you have to innovate past. You keep constantly in an arms race. In the Linux world, nobody's coming checking, or it's like, it's almost like the caretaker opens the old room down the back sometimes and looks in and is like, why is that blinking in the corner? That shouldn't be blinking, right? So that's how you get noticed sometimes.
But it boils down to something which I have said 1,000 times in like takeaway points at the ends of presentations, and that's what you see is what you check, right? If you're not looking, you're not going to find anything.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If you don't have eyes on those platforms. I want to go back to this question, because believe it or not, we've been talking for ages, and we're probably going to get shouted at by the social media team by the time we've finished. So I want to make sure that we address this as well. This is probably one for you, Q. Again, we're talking about XDR and about the Trend Micro solution. This is a very specific question. Is the XDR solution going to work with Trend Micro on-prem stuff? Because not everyone is moving to the cloud in every conceivable way.
Yeah. So a very simple answer is it will work with the Trend Micro products, but it won't nearly be as effective as doing XDR in the cloud. So if you have a sensor, an endpoint, a server, email on-premise, you can have those events forwarded to XDR. You can have the telemetry forwarded. We have forwarders built into our products. The struggle is on the analytics data management layer and the ability for us to correlate mounds and mounds of information. When we actually bring that to customers, they say, I'm not going to set that up on premise. I don't want to manage the storage. I can't do all that. And so really the effectiveness of XDR not using a SaaS-based XDR is always going to be a very small percentage of the effectiveness of a SaaS-based XDR solution. So we will support the sensors, but we won't really have a true XDR correlated detection-based service for you on premise, just because it's just not very realistic.
So the setup that will work in that instance is you have TrendMicro on-prem stuff, whether that's server, endpoint, gateway, whatever, network-related products. We're going to gather all the data from those, whether they are a SaaS solution or an on-prem solution. But the back end we recommend is a cloud-based platform for all the reasons that you just gave.
That's correct. Thank you. You summarized my dribble very well. Yes.
just double checking that I understood.
No, that's very good. That's correct. Yeah.
So there was another question on my list, which actually is for you, Q, but I think it's a nice one to close on, given the time. The future of, so COVID has changed a lot. And in my view, a large proportion of the stuff that's changed isn't necessarily going to change back. Most of it is certainly not going to 100% change back to the way it was. I think our world, and particularly our professional world, have been rocked and will stay rocked forever now. Agree or disagree, that's up to you. So with that in mind, and with the changes that we've seen recently in mind, I'm going to go Bob, Myla, Q, so you don't talk over each other. Why don't you just elaborate a little bit on how you see the future of work in terms of the way that we'll work, the way that we'll interact, and if you like, the opportunities for malfeasance, to use a wonderful word, that may present.
So I'll start with myself then. I think certainly that this working from home setup, as people get more comfortable and settled in, or this remote work will continue. And even after the COVID times, people will still be out of the office more than they're in the office. And that brings a whole different world in terms of defense, but also in terms of attack. So if you're an attacker, you are now not hitting the finance department as they're all sitting in their cubicles together. You're sitting them when one is in Japan, the other one's in somewhere else, and someone else in Germany, and so on. And you're hitting them at their home, where their machine might be secured by the company, but the 10 years old laptop hand-me-down that their kid is playing on is not. And neither is the network storage device under the TV with the movies on it. So if you're attackers, you go after those devices, those kind of IoT or less secure devices. And then once you're on devices that would normally be fairly worthless to you because there's nothing on them, you pivot on the home network and you look for the person working at home. You look for them and you use that as the backdoor into the network. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the unfortunately not too distant future.
Thank you. Myla, what do you see?
Well, I think as you pointed out, Rick, there is no reset button. Even if we're beyond COVID, there is no reset that we can come back to the world of the past, right? So I think so much will change in this aspect. And the two things I'd like to highlight, apart from what Bob has already mentioned, is the fact that number one, I think, is our great equalizer right now is that regardless whether you are in a certain vertical like financial, healthcare, etc., one thing that is going to be common to us in the post-COVID situation is that we will all be using the same infrastructure that is available to a usual consumer, to a usual enterprise. That's the common equalizer. There is no longer that boundary that we're looking at just because we are sitting in this platform right now. So that itself will present the greatest threat also, right? So I don't need to heavily customize attacks on a certain element in a certain sector because the great equalizer is we are all in the same infrastructure. The second area I'd like to highlight is the fact that the mental model, and I'm so sorry, I'm very more or less of a technologist, but an educator. We really have to cross that mental model. One thing that COVID has brought us is that we have disproved the fact that we can work from home. Even the most complex organizations can now work. So what are we going to bring in the next 5 or 10 years now that we are in this elastic environment, right? So I think we need to break old solutions and present new ones that will work in a more stronger backbone and platform.
Very cool. Thank you. Q, I know that you have a lot of conversations with CISOs and CSOs who are in the middle of this changing work situation and have to plan for the future, however uncertain that future may be. So maybe you have more insight from that perspective in terms of, people going back to the office, or have we changed forever? And if we have, what challenges are those people talking about right now?
Yeah, I think they're just now starting to discuss with technology vendors like ourselves that they're going to plan for not going back to the office, or at least not in a major way. And so the two big discussions we see, one is around network re-architecture. So the first 60 days, I reacted. I allocated more bandwidth to VPN. I racked and stacked some more machines, and I bought some laptops, sent them to my workers at home, and from our perspective, I put consumer security on them. Right now, they're going, okay, if I'm going to have this many people working from home, I need a different network architecture. And the second trend I would say is, and we're seeing it daily now, is the acceleration of cloud technologies. So if I'm doing public to public, my employees are public, my customers are public, why am I bringing everything back to a data center? Why am I trying to send that through my enterprise network? Security is always at the top of the list. I think CISOs particularly are now saying, well, I don't really know if I'm that much better than a cloud provider at security. Maybe this is the time to change my organization. But so I would say that the development process, I can't imagine, doesn't be cloud only from here on out.
Mm-hmm. So you think organizations in general are going to be moving to a much more cloud focused, or even 100% cloud based network infrastructure, and trying to leave behind the owning anything effectively?
That's right. And DevOps processes as well. Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, believe it or not, we've been talking for an hour. These things always fly by, but having had three of you here to chat to, I hope for you people out there watching, it's gone as quickly as it has for me. So, first of all, I have to find these buttons down here off the screen. But I wanted to thank you individually for joining me. Bob, always a pleasure, never a chore. And hope that finally we'll get to see each other in person again at some point soon. Thanks very much for joining us. Myla, you're a hero. I know that the volume of data that you and your teams have to deal with would be a challenge to anybody in any organization. I know how long you've been doing it for, and I know how successful you are at doing that. It's been a real pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Rick.
See ya. Q, what can I say? Long-standing C3PO, Trend Micro, your insights are priceless. And the way that you're able to take all of those different conversations that you have and distill them into something that represents a functional roadmap for Trend Micro is second to none. And it's been a rare privilege to have you on a broadcast like this, and maybe we can do it again at some point in the future.
I would love it. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate your kind comments.
Thank you very much. So there you go. That's another hour of my life that just disappeared like that, or maybe just like that. Maybe there wasn't two of them, I don't know, but it was very quick anyway. That's been Let's Talk BlackHat. The point of this whole broadcast was to give you a flavor of the kind of things that we're going to be talking about at the event. It is a virtual event, so you can join us from a location that suits you, relating to all the stuff that we've been speaking about. Come along and listen to our threat research presentation of those two new papers that are going to be published during the event. Sign up for the XDR Threat Defense Challenge. Flex your security muscles, as I said in that supremely and sublimely ridiculous video that you need to go and search for now. And learn from all of the other amazing resources that are available to you at BlackHat. The fact that it's virtual this year, I think, really represents an incredible opportunity for so many people who otherwise wouldn't be there in person. It's an incredible chance to take advantage of the collective knowledge of the entire industry. But if you are coming along, please come along and see us. We've got a lot more stuff to share with you. And thank you again so much for joining us for this broadcast today. I'm still Ron Burgundy, and I'm still very grateful for your presence. Thank you.